Well, welcome everybody. I'm Mary Hannah from Pax Christi, Michigan. Most of you already know me, and I'm super excited and honored to welcome our speaker tonight, John Thorne, who has spent most of his life until like the last few weeks living in Detroit. He just moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Um, and so they are now going to be gifted with his energy and his spirit. But you know, we're gonna make sure we keep some nonviolent hooks in him to keep bringing him back. John has been a campus minister, a teacher, a pastoral associate, and the director of Black Catholic Ministries. And he really works on pulling together people so that every place in our world is a welcoming place, beginning with our own churches, that whole spirit of unity. So, John, thank you so much for joining us tonight and welcome.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's so good to see all of you. I can't see everyone on the screen. I keep flipping back and forth trying to see if I can see everyone. But it's so good to be with you this evening as we continue to dive in and to learn and to experience. But every time I think about topics of racism and issues of race, I always say every time we learn anything, it tends to raise our antenna, or for me, maybe some hair on my head, just to remind us that we can never get completely comfortable with issues that deal with race. And it's always our ardent prayer, or my hope and prayer, is that as we continue to grow, as we continue to learn, that we will continue to push others to join with us. There have been so many people along the journey of my life and so many others who have dedicated themselves to working on racial justice and racial justice issues. And it's the collective work of the we, of people who have a good heart, but also have good mind, that are willing to step out. It starts to change the engagement and how we engage and how we can help others join us on this journey so that we can make a difference and an impact in the lives of all those that we encounter. When we talk about racial issues, when we talk about racial justice, it's not just the issue of black and white. We've seen how our world, most recently, has a need for this discussion of racial justice to cross the color divide. That we look at to the ethnic divide, as we look at to the religious divide, and all of these things and how they work together. And so this evening, well, yes, I will talk from a point of view of mine, but we will also look at the greater world, what is really calling us to. Because one of the things that I try to encourage people across the board is that as you learn something, you have to figure out how do you apply what you've learned to the areas in ministry or the areas of your life in which you work, in which you encounter people. Because when we do that, then we make the best version of ourselves. And so a little bit about me. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, as I said, born and raised in the 7 Mile and Livernois area, a product of Presentation Our Lady of Victory. And then we finally made the journey to the school that was in my neighborhood, which was JZU. And then I matriculated on to U of D High School. And I finally made it to a little tiny town called Wilberforce, Ohio, to Central State University. And it's a famous school because there's a cornfield to the north, a post office to the east, a cornfield to the west, and a KKK barn to the south. And so
Oh no.
on one side, we were surrounded by everything. But for me, my journey in terms of racial justice and how we start to look at things really happened, I guess in its largest form, was probably about 4 weeks after I graduated from high school. At that time, Ameritech, whatever that is now, but Ameritech was hiring high school seniors and those who had just graduated for a program that they called buried line cutovers. And so people all in the city, we have all these aerial lines that come to our house, but in the suburbs and further out, they buried the lines. And then they would trench the lines, cover them back over, and then run a temporary line from the pole to the house. And they hired young adults like myself to go and connect the permanent line that was buried and to take the temporary line back and bring it back to the shop. Thought this is an easy thing. And so my garage was based out of Romulus, Michigan. And every day I went to Romulus and I was in the Romulus area, no more than, I would make it to Livonia and places like that, but no further than that. Well, one day I came to work and I looked at my sheet and I said, oh, this must be a mistake. So I took it back in. I said, something's wrong because this isn't even our area. And the boss looked at it. He said, no, this is where you've been assigned today. And I looked back and I said, how the heck did I get to Jackson, Michigan for an assignment? Out of a garage in Romulus. Wow. So drove clear across the other side of the state. And once I got to Jackson, there was a trailer park and did 3 of those, and it went really well, really fast, really simple. And then I get to a house that was like a farm. And Ameritech, we don't pull cars on property. So we don't drive it in your driveway. We leave the cars on the street. We put our cones out, follow the protocols. You put your vest on, your hard hat, you have your belt, go to the door, knock. No one came to the door. You go and you open up the box and you go and knock again. No one came to the door. You put your little tester phone on to see if anybody's on the line. No one was on the line. I went and knocked on the door again. So I decided I would proceed on with the buried line cutover, and we would hang the tag to let them know that the work was complete. While I was in the process of cutting the cable so I could attach it, I felt something weird behind me, and I wasn't sure what it was. And I thought, well, maybe it's a dog. So I just kept working, and then I heard click, and I said, oh. So I turned around slowly to have a double-barrel shotgun pointed at my head. And the person who had the gun called me a nigger. And he said, I'm going to give you 13 seconds to get the hell off my property. And at that moment, I forgot about Ameritech. I really wasn't even worried about the man saying that. I was thinking, I didn't tell my parents I love them today. Is this how it's all going to end? So I closed the door as soon fast as I could. I don't even know if I finished the whole cutover, but I just started running back to the van. And on the way back, the man had shot the gun in the air. And I was like, okay, this is why I was not supposed to be in Romulus. But as a kid who just graduated from high school, who had the silver spoon life, it was my first experience and I didn't know what to do. And I had to call the supervisor and I was shaking. And I was like, how do I drive all the way back to Romulus like this? And they told me, just take some time off, as much time as you want. And my mother was like, you're not going back to that job anymore. And I was like, but I gotta go back. And so the next morning when I woke up, I got dressed and I went back to work. And sometimes in our lives, we find these moments that become polarizing to us. But then we also find those moments that catapult us into something else. And my thought was, if I give in now, I let this man that I never really saw, who knew nothing about me, have complete power over my life. And I decided at that moment that I was going to get up and I was going to stand up and try to go back up to work again. Now, the moment was a moment that I'll never forget. And especially as a young person from U of D High School, of all places, wow, that was supposed to be the protection, the bubble of protection around us. And with all my experience of East Side parishes and meeting people along the way and walking the streets, had never encountered it in my life. Fast forward many years later, I was working, doing some talks for the U.S. Conference of Bishops, and went to Miami, and I was giving a talk, and all of a sudden I was passing handouts out, and people were coming up and receiving them, and I was like, oh, this is great. You don't have to walk the room. They'll come up for them. And a woman came and spit right in my face. And I thought, what the heck? And I closed my eyes, And she said, you and my bishop duped me because I was not here for a conversation on race. And the whole room had stopped and they were in a frenzy and they said, well, do you want to cancel your talk? I was like, no, I need somebody to take me to a sink to wash my face. And I came back to the room and they were like, it's okay, you can do your talk another day. I said, no, this is why we came. Because until she can see the Christ that's in me, nothing will ever change. When we talk about finding ways of racial justice, when we talk about ways of finding equity in unequitable situations, our first task is to see the humanness in one another. If all I see is the color of your skin, I will never get to know the person that lies within. As people of faith, we're always encouraged to see the God-givenness. Normally we say God-given talent within someone, but if we don't see that the work and the breath of God is in each and every person that God created, then we will always be fighting the same fight, looking for a way to find racial justice within our world, not realizing that the real justice begins inside of each and every one of us. And so we find this boy from Detroit who now lives in Atlanta, who knows nothing about the city. And sometimes I yearn to be back home. But we find that this charge becomes the charge of the church. Not so much a parish or not so much just the Catholic Church, but the universal church. If the call of the church is to follow the commandments of Christ, to love one another as I have loved you, then we must make that the central focus of everything that we do. For love is the central part and the center of it all. And so from there, I would like to begin with prayer this evening as we enter in to our discussions and our time today to bring along our thought process and how we ourselves can see ourselves as instruments of divine love, but also of peace within our world so that we can make change. See if I can get this to share. All right. Can you all see it on the screen?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. Well, let us pray. And then the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Dear God, in our efforts to dismantle racism, we understand that we struggle not merely against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. Those institutions and systems that keep racism alive by perpetuating the lie that some members of the family are inferior and others superior. Oh, there we go. Create in us a new mind and heart that will be able to see brothers and sisters in the faces of those divided by racial categories. Give us the grace and strength to rid ourselves of racial stereotypes that oppress some of us while providing entitlements to others. Help us to create a church and a nation that embraces the hopes and fears of the oppressed, people of color where we live, as well as those around the world. Heal your family, God, and make us one with you, in union with our brother Jesus and empowered by your Holy Spirit. And that prayer came to us from Pax Christi, a beautiful prayer. And so it becomes the jumping point of our engagement this evening, that realizing that when we talk about racism, we're talking not so much about an individual. Yes, there's an ism to the individual expression, But when we talk about racism in the context of, especially in our American context, what we're really talking about are systems and institutions that continuously write policies that work on behalf of a certain group, and other groups at the same time are penalized by the groups that they were born into. And when we talk about American racism, when we talk about, I guess let's back up. When we talk about slavery, slavery has been part of human existence for almost forever when we look at that. But when we talk about the context of American racism, what we're talking about is how it was done solely based upon racial category. In the wider context of slavery, we see that slavery happened many times, whether it was being by countries conquering other countries, and then they put them into servitude, or else people based upon the class system that they were born into. But in the American situation, it was solely based on race. And then that race was to work for many years, sometimes the rest of their lives, and never knowing if they would ever be have an opportunity to buy themselves out of slavery or to come out of slavery. My own family as an experience with that. My great 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 grandfather was a slave. His name was Tobias Henson. His story is at both the Smithsonian gallery that was built, museum down in DC, as well as the Smithsonian Museum in Wilberforce, Ohio. And very interesting because my father was the only person in the family on his side of the family that went to Central State. So how it made an exhibit there in that museum, I have no clue. But Tobias Henson worked as a slave. And one of the things that he was promised was upon his master's death that he would be freed. And so when his master died, he was free from slavery. Yet his wife and his daughter was not. And so he started working. He went back to work for the same family, trying to raise money to buy the freedom of his wife and his daughter. Along that journey, his wife died, and there was a child of the family. And so then the daughter and the wife went to the son. And the son promised that he would free them, and he did free them. And then when the mother died, he received some more land to sharecrop on. And the beautiful thing about this land was at one point, it became the highest point in Washington, D.C. So from that piece of land, you could look over every part of D.C., from the Capitol to the White House. And at some point, Tobias had met a group of priests called the Josephites. And they built a church on that land, Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And still today, that church is still active there. Many different buildings from the very first wood building that was started. But also on that land sits one of the largest ballrooms outside of a hotel in Washington, D.C. And the room is called the Panorama Room because the back wall is all glass. So as you hold events, you can look over all of Washington, D.C. And so my father's mother's family is still there, the Smith family, as they are now descendants of Tobias Henson. But when we talk about the gifts that people bring, or even the stories that we bring, there's stories that have to be told. My aunt loves to do research, and she has researched both sides of my father's family and continues and has pulled some of my cousins and myself in to also get to know, to understand this history and this legacy. And sometimes the history isn't always easy to trace because records were deleted or names were changed, or you find things like Girl Sarah, and you're like, oh, Girl Sarah. Then you have to try to find parent records to try to put these stories back together. But in the big picture, we are a sum of all of our experiences. And all of our experiences play a role into who we are today. And I hope that whether your experiences were big or small, that each of your lives experiences help to catapult you into the great things that you all are doing. Not only through Pax Christi, but also in your lives. But it also becomes a challenging point for us to know that there's always more we could do. I hate receiving awards because all the award tells you is you have more to do so you can get another award. But if people just don't acknowledge anything, then you can just keep doing what you're doing and you don't have to feel a heightened sense of awareness of what you're doing in the community. But it becomes a great gift and sometimes a curse. But how do we keep working? When I think about racial justice, I think about the big figures within American history. You know, I think about a person like a Frederick Douglass, who on one end, we say, oh, well, he was a Republican and this and this. And like, okay, yeah. But on one end, he was told that he was going to be denied just the very basic things of owning a house. Yet he was committed in finding ways to not only own the house, but also to find a way to buy the bank. And so then the bank could have the house, and then he would have access in a place where he and his family
do our ladies
to live their lives.
like that? How come
But then at the same time, we also see other figures who may not be as big or as wide, but we find that people had an opportunity to start to change the world.
They're dirty.
My mother and many of her friends growing up were involved in NAACP in Cleveland, Ohio, and they committed themselves to the practices of nonviolence. So they would go and do sit-ins at schools and at lunch counters, and they would find opportunities for themselves to be able to come together. And while they work in the South, find ways to become more nonviolent within their own lives. And I think that each and every one of those experiences also helps to look at what's really going on in the bigger picture. When we talk about racial justice and this need for us to be able to continue to work, we also have to realize of how the ism of racism works in each and every one of our lives, how we see these opportunities and for growth within our lives, but also these opportunities for us to continue to stretch ourselves. Learning is like a rubber band. I don't think it's ever finished, but it's something that we have to keep doing. And that the more that we put within our own realm, that rubber band continues to stretch. And I hope that one day our rubber bands will continue to stretch so much that maybe it seems like it's going to want to break, but it doesn't. Because we know that there's always an opportunity for more. But when we talk about how people have been categorized as a people, racism boxes people in. We say, hey, these are the skill set or these are the opportunities for a person because of who you are and how you look. And so then those start to become the way we start to form the isms of our lives. And it's easy sometimes when we talk about racism to deflect the things so that we'll talk about other things like feminism. Where I was in a talk one day and they said, hey, well, what about that? I said, well, you know, our topic today is racism. They said, yeah, but I'm really passionate about it. I said, I understand. But we also have to make sure that we stay focused when we talk about the various issues to make sure that people understand what we're talking about and that we also don't get sidetracked. So when we talk about racism itself, we know that we sometimes classify people. How many times have people been classified by an ism of how we think that a group should act or should work or should do things about? And sometimes that classification becomes how we visualize everything. And when we talk about isms, they're constructs. They're not something that's concrete that this is it. Because I know if I look at all of you all, I can't say that any one of you speaks for your entire race another classification made up. But just as I don't speak for every Black person, we can't also assume that the things that I do become the cast that every Black person should be cast by. And so that's how this development of the ism starts to come about. That somebody has a thought, and the thought says, well, okay, well, what is an ism? Well, all Black people like fried chicken. That's the first one we'll start with. That will be my first cast. And you say, okay. And then you meet somebody and they say, oh, I don't eat chicken at all. And then the first thing you say was, how's that happen? You're not Black. But these falsehoods start to become how we look at things in a reality. I was doing some work at a school, and I was in the hallway one day, and a kid came out and said, hey, Jose, tell your father to come lay my concrete. And I said, what the heck? So I went right to the student, and I said, what makes you think that his dad lays concrete? Well, all Mexicans, they do concrete. I said, do they? I said, I don't know that to be a fact. But even the things that happen in households easily get transferred to our children. Whether they're realities of what we have or not. And so I always tell myself, hey, everybody needs to be careful what they say, because we don't know how people will take whatever comes out of our mouth, even in anger, as a reality and a truth that they will subject someone else to. And so as we look at these characteristics, we find that most of them are fake. I can't tell you that everybody is a baller like Beyonce, that we've all won 32 Grammy Awards, but the reality of our situation is that every person we encounter, we have to experience them for who they are. So how does this work even within the church? Sometimes the isms that we cast on people make them invisible to us. And you say, what? How does that happen? Because there are people that we know that we consider people who are in group, and there are people who are out of group. And so the in group doesn't have to be anything big. It doesn't even have to be a race classification. You can say, hey, I have a child and they play soccer. So soccer parents, moms or dads, become my friends because our children do something that's similar. Or else, at the same time, you could say, well, because we go to this church or we belong to this group, these people are now in my in group. And then what happens is your in group becomes smaller and smaller. And the outer group, the people who don't do the things that you do or hang out in the places that you hang out, become larger and larger. And so even though there are people who are outside of our in group, they also become outside of our periphery. They become almost invisible to us. Not that they're not there, but we don't find a way to acknowledge. You say, well, how does that happen in the church? How many times have we come into a church with our blinders on to sit in our same seat? Because I sit in the 9th pew on the left-hand side, and we really only talk to the people who are in the 7th and 6th and 10th and 11th pew around us, and we really don't know the rest of the people in our church. And it could happen very easily if you go to a large church. But now it's not that the people aren't apart or that they're so far cast from us, but because they're not in our in group, they're just outside of our periphery. But when we talk about racial justice, when we talk about human justice, we have to find out who those people are who are around us. And if they're not in our peer view, if they're not in our in group, how do we find ways to engage them? How do we find ways to bring them in? The one thing I love about church is that it's comfortable for us. But the part that I hate about church is that it's comfortable for us. because we're never stretched. Uh, there's a woman who goes to my church and said, "Oh, well, if you leave, I don't know if I'm going to come to church anymore because I don't really know anybody." And I thought, what? And I was like, "But you've been here for 10 years." She said, "Well, I talked to you and I talked to Father Thomas and I talked to about 2 other ladies, but that's it." And I thought, wow, at the masses she came to, there has to be 300 or 400 people. And I was like, what about the opportunities that are there? And so I think about the scripture says, the harvest is ripe, but the laborers are few. Sometimes we have to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone so that we can meet the people on the periphery of our view to bring them in to what we have to offer, to understand the gifts that they bring, but also to share who we are with them, because as we do that, we start to raise our own antennas and fear starts to settle. One of the things that I found that I encountered when I started to encounter people of different races was that as much as I thought I knew, I didn't know nothing. On the periphery, we see the things that are above the waterline. I can see clothing, I can see hair, I can see food if they share. But it doesn't really give us insight into who they really are. What are the value systems that the culture was built upon? What are the gifts and the things, and what are the things that they see important that I may never see? Because when I'm looking, I'm only looking at what I know and pure surface. And so then the next task to finding some type of common ground is to sit down and talk with people. Scary. Because people who aren't in our peer view and aren't in our inner zone, we don't really know how to start the conversation. How many of you have ever been on an elevator and been on an elevator with people you didn't know, and that door opens and the first thing we do is look to the ground, like the ground was going to say something? Or else we turn it and say, nice weather today, huh? Or maybe in the last few weeks, go Lions. But it becomes this whole sense of, we really don't know what to say. And I think my son did it best. His 7th grade year at Jesu, he was on this big kick that he was going to be St. John the Evangelist. And so kids have nothing that holds them back. That's what I love about kids. Nothing holds a kid back. And so we were in the grocery store one day, and he's helping to unload the front of the car. I'm unloading the back. And there was a woman standing there, and he said, hey. She turned around and said, hi. He said, my name is John. What church do you go to? And I'm like, oh, you don't ask somebody what church they go to. Might be introduction. And he said, well, do you go to church? And I'm like, oh, here we go. And and so I'm sitting there like, oh my gosh, but he's on a roll, so let's see what he does. And she was like, well, he said, I'm Catholic. Are you? And she said, no. He said, well, there's a really nice church just down the street. It's called Jesu. The pastor's really nice. His name is Father Phil. He sings okay, but it's a really nice church and the people are nice. And you should go there if you don't go to church. And she looks at him and I look at her and I just smile. And she said, well, I haven't been to church in a long time. He says, well, you should consider going. He said, there are all types of people there. Black people and white people and Indian people, they're all there. And I'm like, what is going on? And she says, well, maybe I'll come and see you at church. He said, oh no, you won't see me there. She said, no. He said, oh no, I go to a church a long way away, almost downtown, called Sacred Heart. But since you came to this grocery store, I figured you lived around here, so I was inviting you to my school. And the lady said, oh, well, why didn't you invite me to your church? said, oh, because I just figured it'll be closer for you. You might actually make it. And I'm sitting there like, oh my gosh. But if all of us were like kids, if we would have no boundaries, nothing that holds us back, that we were fearless in our outreach, fearless in our way to communicate with the unknown, with those who are on the periphery of our vision, what a different world we would be in. What a different world we would have. So often I think of that story of my son when I have to go places because unbeknownst to many people, I'm an introvert. I have a light switch. I can turn it on and I can do it as long as I need to. But when it's time for that light switch to come off, I collapse. Every time I went with the U.S. bishops and I would do that talk, my talk was 3 hours long. And when it was over, I would disappear for 2 hours. But then I'll come back in time for dinner and I was back alive again. But it takes everything out of me. But what if we were all fearless like a child and would be able to go and to reach and find ways to reach out so that there were strangers no more to us, but that everybody became part of the fold of our families of God? I think that becomes the greatest gift, but also the greatest challenge for us. For us who are in the church, whether it's Catholic or not, is how do we find ways to reach out to all of those who are in our periphery, to make sure that no one is left out, that table that we talk about, that is a table of welcome for all, is truly available. And as it's available, that we ourselves are changed by the experience of each culture and each family and each person that we encounter. I think this is where the church comes alive, that this becomes the real gift of recognizing the diversity of the social construct of race, but the diversity and the gifts that lie within each and every person that we encounter. When we talk about racism, it's all about division. There's so many things that divide us in our own lives each and every day. And when I think about the way that racism has divided and continues to divide, whether we talk about the work that I did in affordable housing and seeing how our housing laws um, and our policies from our banks for decades and decades continue to make sure that Blacks and Hispanics and depending on the circle that you were in, even those Italians didn't have a right or a place to anything that was available there within the communities. And that redlining and redistricting, as that continues to happen today, but the redlining in communities to make sure that people who might have been able to afford had no access to communities in which they wanted to live. And to think about as that happened, the generations of children who could have had great educational opportunities based upon the places where families wanted to live but were denied, and yet what that also did for another system, as we look at our education system and how over time it has failed, not only our children, but also the communities in which they were called to serve in many of our metropolitan districts. I look at affordable housing, I look at the Fair Housing Acts and the things that happened even within our transportation and how you can drive in the city of Detroit along a freeway that, yes, is sunk, but not very far. And the only thing that's to block sound is a fence. But in most places, the fence isn't there. It's just the poles that were supposed to hold the fence. And yet, as we travel outside of the city, we find these big walls that block the sound so that those neighborhoods do not have the loud noise and from cars on the freeway and truck horns and accidents. And I say, well, where's the justice even in that? If we're going to talk about racial equity, if we're going to talk about a way of leveling the playing field, if we're going to talk about giving a ladder to those who need a ladder so that they can see over the fence the same way everyone else sees the fence, then we have to do it in every aspect of our lives. It has to happen not only from the education system, but into our banking system, from our banking system into our transportation. And how is it that we live in a metropolis as large as Detroit is, yet we do not have great transportation to connect people to the jobs, whether they're in the city or in the suburbs, and yet we still can't find a way to pass a millage that would allow it to happen. Now, it would be so easy for us to blame it all on the big three because we're a car city and we need cars to survive. But when you look at other major cities, people still own cars, yet they have busing and other transit systems to make sure that people can get from point A to point B. But why is it in this great chocolate city, they say one of the poorest Black cities in America, that we're still struggling for the basic things to make sure that opportunity across the board is leveled and that people have the access that they need to everything so that they can survive? These become the real issues. When we talk about racial justice, we also have to talk about racial inequality and how for years, all of these things were stacked up to make sure that the systems always won, but the systems at the same time kept people in check. Now, one way we can look and say, well, what are the benefits that came from some of these inequities? And people say, well, look, we have a whole system, a schooling and education system that was created. We look at the HBCUs that were created, but the very first ones were created by people of great faith, by people who had an understanding of what it meant to be slaves. And as they were free, they formed the AME Church. And so our first HBCUs were religious institutions, that they gathered the funds that they had and the things that they had, that they wanted to make sure that education was at the forefront. And then the states they were starting to become petitioned to figure out how they could also help educate the former slaves. And what was that happened? And all these institutions started changing the way that they started working within these communities. After the freedom of the slaves from the Emancipation Proclamation, it wasn't the end all. Because many of them went back to be slaves again because they didn't know how to any other form way of life. They didn't have a way to make money to survive for their families, so they went back onto those very same plantations that they worked as slaves for pennies, trying to find a way to make a way for their family. And yet we look at our society today and we say hundreds of years have passed by since the emancipation. And we look at the 50 years, pushing on 60 years of the civil rights movement, and we say, what has happened? What have we gained? Sometimes I think for every step we take forward, we take 10 steps back. How is it that in our day and age, we're still fighting for voting rights for all Americans? And as soon as we start to think about passing some of these bills, then they start taking things away and say, oh, this isn't fair. What is wrong with giving somebody a glass of water or even providing a jug for people standing in the hot sun trying to cast a vote? Not that it has to be tied to anything political, but how are those simple things becoming issues again? Because in the long run, what it really does is we start to forget the humanity that lies in each and every individual. Now, as we're slowly pushing towards another election, we will continue to see and hear of things that in many of our minds will say, this isn't right. How do we find ways to level this playing field? Within the last 2 elections, friends, myself and some friends of mine started going out door to door, just going, we're going to knock. The Democratic Party and the city gave us some lists, and we started going door to door to try to figure out who was registered. If they weren't registered, would they register? And sometimes we were just going and having conversations with people on the street as to why they don't vote. And the things are crazy. Just as when we worked in the community trying to have people do the census, the things Big Brother's watching. Well, which Big Brother? You know, if I take the census, they're going to have my social security number. Oh, wait a minute. Who'd you get the social security number from? The government. So that means they already know your social security number. And, you know, there's so many thoughts and so many misconceptions that are out there. My vote doesn't count. That's the most common one. My vote doesn't count. I'm just one person. But if 50,000 people felt the same way in any district, it could change a whole election. Because most times, we don't get 50,000 people from a district to come and vote. The city of Detroit gets excited when we have 8% turnout of electorates who actually come and vote. And I thought, that is horrible. But before we get to the actual presidential election, that's wonderful for them. But what is it that's stopping everybody from voting? When I think about the stories of Tobias Henson's grandson and the push and how he would walk to vote. And then when he would get there, he was told he was at the wrong location and they would send him to another place. And when he got there, they said, no, you were supposed to vote where you were. And he got back and they said they were closed. How many times that basic things that as American citizens have been denied to people, I say, where is the justice in that? But it didn't stop people. So many people had that happen to them in their lives, yet they kept pushing. They became the great American dream for so many of us, that in the face of all types of adversities and denials, that they kept pushing. And their pushing kept moving, motivating other generations to keep pushing. And while we're here in 2024, we might be comfortable in our homes now, but we are all called to keep pushing. Even if we're not pushing for ourselves because maybe someone else has already pushed a way for us to be there, but now we are called to push for those who have no voice, for those who are outside of the peer view, sometimes even of our justice and our government system. Those who we have to advocate for who are pushed outside of the systems and institutions that continuously keep these same policies going. This becomes the real work of the church. Maybe today in our society, you're not going on and holding out a sign. Maybe your front lawn will not be like my last front lawn, littered with faces of Blacks who have been killed along the journey fighting for justice. But there's always work for us to do. One of my favorite freedom songs was, I ain't gonna let nobody turn us around, turn us around, turn us around. I ain't gonna let nobody turn us around, because this has to become our plea. That as we're working and fighting on this road for justice, nothing can deter us from what we've been called to do. Nothing should deter us from seeing the face of Christ in everyone we meet. Nothing can stop us from loving as Christ asks us to love. Because when we do all of these things, it becomes a great gift to us, but we also start to level the playing field. What I found in my last 10 years that the greatest thing I could do right now is to advocate, whether it's in fair housing, whether it's through systems of banking structures that the Alliance was borrowing from. We have to advocate for those who will honestly look at the plights of people. Just as we did as an organization, we started becoming the lender. We have 3 houses right now that people are living in where we became the lender. We sat there and we worked with them, and they went through a financial literacy course with us. And then we started to teach them about the basics of housing. And then we started to look at finances. And if a family could pay $1,000 a month for a house, they could get the house for $1,000. And this same house had $80,000 of renovation. The only thing that was original really to the house was the banister and the steps that went to the second floor, but all new electrical, all new plumbing, all new heating. We took on $100,000 of debt, sold the house for $80,000, and we made sure that each family, so one family pays $1,000. A very similar house looks just like it. The other family pays $750 a month. Have another house down the street, very similar to it. The family, it's just built a little different, but they're all about 104 years old. The other family pays $650. You say, well, how does that work? The square footage in all the houses are the same. The amount of the investment was just about the same, yet everybody's able to pay what they can do. This is what we call equity. And the funny thing is everybody's term is exactly the same, a 10-year term. And wherever we are at 10 years, we do debt forgiveness. So if at 10 years, you still owe $45,000 on the house, $45,000 is wiped off. Because our main goal is to make sure that people have access to safe, affordable housing. Now, there's no way you can go to Huntington or Flagstaff and after 10 years, they're just going to wipe your debt away. But we got to think outside the box. We'll find other ways to make up for the money. And that's the great gift of administration. That's your problem to do, not theirs. But this became a way for us to find a way to have equitable, affordable housing. Because in many neighborhoods in the city, the vacant land grab started. And so once that land is no longer controlled by nonprofits or people who want affordability, the land is the most expensive thing, and then they build a house on top of it. You build a small, expensive house on an expensive piece of land, that means now you have a very expensive house on a piece of land. And so we've been buying up plots and plots and plots of land within the neighborhood, in the Gratiot Woods neighborhood, to make sure that we can always find a way to have affordable housing. That even if we rent the space to someone to build a house on, that we will always own the land, and that the land will always be affordable. And these become the tools. These become the forward thinking that we need organizations, nonprofits, and others to do to make sure that everybody who wants access to affordable housing can have that type of access. And when we do this, we start to create justice. Maybe not in the justice that our parents were marching for, but it becomes an equitable justice in which everybody has an opportunity to be able to come to the table, to have a table to even feed their family from. And then it becomes a way for them, because we don't keep these houses, that they will be able to have a means of income, of long-term family wealth building, because once we sign that house over, they have the house and the land. And the only thing that we ask in that is that as we sign the house over, that there's a clause that they could never double, triple, or quadruple the price of the house, so that the next person who moves in is able that they're able to walk away with something, but that they're not going to buy a house for 80,000 and sell it for 600,000 because that's where the market went. But that there will always be some type of affordability within the community. In that community, we do have long-term lease properties that we will always own, but others that we're finding ways to start to build a generational wealth that will begin to change lives. And so all of these things are tools that um, I guess not to say they're novel ideas, but they're tools that can be used to find a way to create generational wealth, to create opportunities for families who've been left out of opportunities, to start to level that playing field. But also, the biggest thing is that what we're doing is we're building community, that we're building community right there. And that people who grew up in the community, who have a long history of the community, and people who are moving new to the community, and no matter what they are, black or white, that they're starting to build community because what binds them is their love for the city and their commitment to build change right where they're at. So all of these things become wonderful tools. But who would have thought that a small kid from 7 Mile and Livernois with the silver spoon life will find a way that his heart and his life will be completely transformed. Not only by helping the people that I knew in the community, but going into communities where I didn't know anybody, yet at the same time, my world was opened up by the experiences that my parents were able to afford me. These same experiences that we're trying to make sure that even people who may not be able to afford it can have it for their children. U of D has worked hard in the last few years to come up with the scholarship program that actually works. And there's a Black alumni scholarship where a Black alumnus can sponsor a child, can write a letter on behalf of a child, and that they will be able to receive a scholarship. And so it's finding ways to create these pathways of opportunity for everyone so that, as my son says, that they can live their best life. And when they do that, then we all continue to grow. And so as we traverse through this time, I know I need some time for questions, but it's our opportunity to continue to stretch our rubber band beyond our comfort zone, beyond the things that we know, to look at who are those people in our periphery and find ways to help them. Thank you all.
Thank you, John. Oh my, what a wonderful evening we've just spent with you. Um, I am gonna open it up so that people can ask questions. So I'm gonna change the view a little bit. Um, and feel free to raise your hands and or unmute yourselves and ask whatever questions you have. But I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. What a great way to end the day.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? That's actually kind of a good thing, John. You covered all the bases.
And I saw Ed's comment
What
that
did
we
Ed say?
have so much need the church to help
Yeah.
educate us on alternative economics. There are a number of models within the global church, but we hear so little of it in the U.S., specifically in Michigan. So yes, I've been looking in some of the programs with the United Methodist Church because their Global Solidarity Office is here in Atlanta, Georgia. And just looking at some of the models that are there, and I was like, oh yeah, I guess I should come on and see how I can get involved, because they also have a thing called Heart Atlanta, and it looks at homelessness and housing. And so just trying, I have no idea where I'm going to work, but I'm trying to find my footing. So I'm looking at everything. And I think I still have something to offer. And so it's just still looking at how those opportunities will be able to manifest down here.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I just have to unmute. There we go. John, thank you very much. It's such an inspiring talk. I wondered, and maybe you mentioned this a little bit at the start. I was jotting down some notes there. So if I missed it, I apologize. But did you have a particular inspirational role model in particular that got you sort of motivated to be such a wonderful activist? And I just wanted to say, it sounds like your son is kind of a chip off the old block with the example you used there too. So, but anyway, did you have someone that was, inspiring to you in particular?
Yeah, I think that I guess the biggest inspiration for me would have been my pastor, Father Thomas, a true activist at heart. But I also think that, along the way, there have been several others. When I was in college, there was a gentleman named Armando Henderson, another activist in Ohio. And then as I went further in Ohio, I hung out in Cincinnati for a little while. The pastor of the funeral home where I was doing some work, at Pastor Jordan. And I think that there have just been people along the way, and I think every step along the way has taught me a different version of the journey, that no one complete story was totally complete. But along the way, I found ways to incorporate various things into it. Yes.
Thank you.
I know there was another question about the affordable housing model. And so, Dan, we use different models. This one model was the last model. And the model can only work if there is an influx of money. We had received a gift from Nativity of Our Lord when Father Jerry Singer died, that he left the Alliance $800,000. And the only stipulation was use it in the community. And I said, okay, so we have to, well, it was great because that's the community. The church sits in our development area. And so, we started brainstorming about what we would do. And they're like, oh, we're going to do this and this and this. I'm like, stop. I was like, what's the biggest impact that will impact individuals? I mean, the visual thing is wonderful about putting up or refacing these houses and redoing them and selling them. But how do we find ways to have a sustainable impact? And then we started looking at programs that were available. And, the programs, even with the city, with the zero interest, you have to have a certain credit score. Well, if people were trying to recover or trying to start and they have a terrible credit score, what access do they give to this? And so then we started also looking at various models of education. And what we decided was that we would start with education. And we would educate people on what it means to be a homeowner. And if people were ready to take the leap, sometimes people go through our training and they're like, oh, I'm not ready yet. I'll come back in about 5 years, and it's fine. But if they were ready to take the leap, then we would move forward with them on a land contract deal. And then after 10 years, the land contract would end. We would transfer the property into their name, yet we were going to work with them based upon the family size, based upon the income, to make sure that they would be a sustainable candidate for a house. Because the worst thing to do is to set somebody up for failure. Because they went through your training, you say, well, this house is going to be $2,000 and they make $2,400 a month. And how are they going to pay the lights, the gas, food, transportation, insurance? All these things are factors. And so we started looking at that. And so we came up with this model that will be a workable fix for each family. So it just needs money. And but there are surely streams of income that are out there. When we look at the Gilbert Family Foundation, Enterprise Community Partners, but they only work with community development groups. And so we need to make sure that we're connecting community development groups to these sources of income so that this work can continue. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I did have a litany that I would like to do. One of the in the Archdiocese of Chicago, several years ago now, or I guess it's more than several years ago, Anita Baird was in the Office of Racial Justice there. And one of the things that they worked on was a litany for anti-racist church. And I think that even if we take the word church out, we can insert anything else in, and the litany still works in many ways. And so as we conclude this evening, I did want to pray that with you all and have you all join me. And it's fine if we unmute. As my father always says, the church is a messy place. And so it's okay to have a lot of mess. That's why we didn't do choir rehearsal today, because when we all sing, it sounds like a big mess on here. But this is Litany for Anti-Racist Church. And as they wrote, as long as any of our churches remain closed or resistant to invite, welcome, and embrace people of different races and ethnicities, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as hiring and appointing a satisfactory minimum of qualified people of color to decision-making and other positions in our parishes, schools, and pastoral centers is done out of tokenism, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as qualified persons of color seeking positions as principal or teacher becomes against a need not apply attitude in any school in the Archdiocese, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as key lay and priest advisory bodies, Finance Committee, Archdiocesan Council of Catholic Women, Archdiocesan Pastoral Council, Presbyteral Council, Priest Placement Board, and the College of Consultors do not reflect the proportionate diversity of laity and priests in the Archdiocese, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as racial and ethnic slurs are directed at children on our athletic courts and fields and playgrounds, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as any teacher in our school feels a need to lighten up or tough up on children because of their color, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as studies in our schools do not include experiences and achievements of people of color, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as parish celebrations, and look, I'm losing words here. Sorry. Here, let me do this. 1 second. Okay, that's not gonna work. Hold on. Everything is hiding right there.
Back up.
Yes, I see. Hold on, I'm gonna pause this share for a second. Okay, there we go. Can we see? Oh, no, there we go.
Yep.
Okay, there we are. Now I can see everything. As long as parish celebrations of Mass, I'm sorry, wrong one. Oh, where am I at? Okay, here we go. As long as parish celebrations do not reflect the diversity of foods reflected in the cultures of its parishioners, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as the liturgical celebrations in any of our churches do not reflect respect for cultural diversity of its parishioners, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as priests coming from different countries and priests of different racial and ethnic backgrounds born in the U.S. lack the necessary supports to be accepted and integrated well into parish life and the presbyteral collegiality, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as our parishes, and here we go again. Let me go back to the other screen. Sorry. As long as our parish sharing relationships, these are two of them. I'm sorry, I'll do both. As long as our parish sharing relationships reflect only monetary and a one-way sharing, then we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as our churches and schools see no need to learn about and to celebrate the cultures of our parishioners and neighbors, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as our parishes and the people see no need to work against discrimination in housing, healthcare, education, and jobs, we need to create an anti-racist church. As long as any Catholic or any Christian who claims to be a disciple of Jesus Christ cannot look into the eyes of a person of color and see a brother or sister they would embrace, share peace with, and accompany on their faith journey, we need to create an anti-racist church. This becomes our work each and every day, that we continue to, where we are, to create an anti-racist church. Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you,
John. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you. What a wonderful. And John, if I can get the two prayers that you did today, I'd love to put that with the video.
I will email it to you.
Great. All right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. It has really been a gift, and I would just invite everyone to give John one more round of applause before he gets to retire for the day, I hope.
A little bit more work, but it'll be good. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night. Oh, good to see everyone.
Everybody.
Bye.